leave to cross-examine Minister Gordhan. Once I've delivered it, there will be copies that will be given to the lawyers on all sides, and a limited number of copies to the media. The only issue that I left undecided in my judgment of 16 April 2019 in Mr. Moyane's application for leave to cross-examine Minister Pravin Gordhan was whether I should grant Mr. Moyane leave to cross-examine Minister Gordhan on what I said was an allegation by Mr. Gordhan that in laying the criminal charges that he laid against Minister Gordhan, Mr. Moyane had acted maliciously. It was not clear to me whether Mr. Gordhan intended to allege or alleged in his affidavit that Mr. Moyane had acted maliciously in laying those charges against him. I stated in that judgment that in due course I would issue directions on the way forward, the chairperson's directions. Subsequent to the delivery of my judgment, I issued directions with regard to the outstanding issue. The relevant parts of the directions read, and I quote, 1. Mr. Gordhan must deliver to the Commission and serve on Mr. Moyane on or before Wednesday, 15 May 2019, a short clarificatory affidavit in which he clarifies whether, in stating in his statement of 11 October 2018 that Mr. Moyane acted malicious in laying charges against him and others, he meant that A, in laying charges against Mr. Gordhan and others, Mr. Moyane was motivated wholly or in part by or he sought to advance the objectives of state capture, or he was abusing a legal process for his own personal goals that had either nothing or little to do with a legitimate complaint relating to an alleged crime. 2, to the extent that 1A above may not correctly reflect what Mr. Gordhan meant, he must succinctly state what he meant when he stated that Mr. Moyane had acted maliciously in laying the charges against him and others. Mr. Gordhan's clarificatory affidavit. In due course, Mr. Gordhan delivered a clarificatory affidavit. In that affidavit, he, among other things, said, A, he had never said that Mr. Moyane had acted maliciously when he laid charges against him. B, it was Mr. Moyane who had said in his affidavit that Mr. Gordhan had implied that he had acted maliciously in laying the criminal complaint against him. C, he did not know Mr. Moyane's state of mind when Mr. Moyane laid the criminal complaint against him. D, Mr. Moyane's motive in laying the charges against him was irrelevant. E, he disagreed with Mr. Moyane's explanation that in laying the criminal complaint against him, Mr. Moyane had acted as any reasonable commissioner of SARS in his position would have acted. F, he personally believed that Mr. Moyane, he personally believed that, quote, Mr. Moyane did abuse legal processes for reasons already explained in, close quotes, in my evidence, close quotes. G, his belief that Mr. Moyane had abused legal processes was, and I quote, based on my experience of his defiant attitude and vilification of me following my reappointment as Minister of Finance, which was aimed at forcing me to resign from that position so that the capture of National Treasury could proceed under a different minister, close quotes. H, open quotes, to use the words of the chairperson's directions, I therefore do mean that Mr. Moyane, quote, was motivated wholly or in part by, or he sought to advance the objectives of state capture, close single quotes, and that, open single quotes, he was abusing a legal process for his own personal goals that had either nothing or little to do with a legitimate complaint relating to an alleged crime, close double quotes. This statement by Mr. Gordhan appears to be linked to that part of the directions which required him to say whether he meant that in laying the charges against him, Mr. Moyane, open double quotes, was motivated wholly or in part by, or he sought to advance the objectives of state capture, close double quotes. I, quotes, he believes, that is Mr. Gordhan, that Mr. Moyane's personal goals while he was SARS commissioner included the advancement of the state capture project, close double quotes. J, his belief that Mr. Moyane's personal goals, in single quotes, while he was commissioner of SARS, open double quotes, included the advancement of the state capture project, close double quotes, is founded on what, open double quotes, is founded on what we all now know about how, single quotes, the failure of integrity and governance at SARS, soundly evidenced by the change over 4 years, has certainly compromised the performance of its core function of collecting tax to the detriment of the country at large, close single quotes, as found by Justice Nugent in the Commission of Inquiry into Tax Administration and Governance by SARS, in brackets, the Nugent Inquiry, page 477, paragraph 19 of the final report of the Nugent Inquiry, close quotes and close double quotes. Did Mr. Gordhan ever allege malice on Mr. Moyane's part? Paragraph 5. The directions of 6 May 2019 were issued on the basis that Mr. Gordhan had alleged in his statement of 11 October 2018 to this commission that Mr. Moyane had acted maliciously in laying the charges that he had laid against him. In his clarificatory affidavit, Mr. Gordhan says he never made such an allegation. Here is why it was stated in the directions that Mr. Gordhan had alleged that Mr. Moyane had acted maliciously in laying the charges that he had laid against him. A. In the last sentence of paragraph 104 of Mr. Gordhan's statement of 11 October 2018, Mr. Gordhan said, and I quote, charges against me relating to that unit had been filed by Mr. Moyane on 15 May 2015, in brackets SAPS Brooklyn case number 427/05/15, close brackets and close quotes. B, in paragraph 113 of the same statement, Mr. Gordhan states, and I quote, this set of events combined with what is set out below, was the beginning of what appeared to be a campaign to force me to resign as Minister of Finance and continue the efforts to capture the National Treasury thereafter, close quotes. The set of events referred to at the beginning of paragraph 113 seems to include the event of the filing of the charges by Mr. Moyane against Mr. Gordhan mentioned in paragraph 104 of Mr. Gordhan's statement. C, in paragraph 130 of his October 8, 2018 statement, Mr. Gordhan said that, open quotes, double quotes, the orchestrated campaign against me and other leaders of National Treasury raged within cabinet, the institutions of state, and on certain media and social media platforms, close double quotes. He then says that that campaign, open double quotes, shifted to yet another front later in the year when I became the target of malicious and seemingly politically motivated criminal charges, close double quotes. The charges which Mr. Gordhan describes in this quotation as double quotes, malicious and politically motivated criminal charges, close double quotes, are the charges, in quotes, that he says in paragraph 104 of his statement were filed by Mr. Moyane against him. I think it is what Mr. Gordhan says in paragraphs 104, 113, and 130 of his statement, and possibly elsewhere as well, that suggests that Mr. Gordhan meant that Mr. Moyane had acted maliciously in laying the charges against him. Mr. Moyane says in his affidavit in the application for leave to cross-examine Mr. Gordhan that Mr. Gordhan implied such allegation in his statement. Counsel for Mr. Moyane submits that whether Mr. Gordhan made the allegation expressly or by implication is neither here nor there, as what is important is that it was made. Paragraph 7. Bearing in mind that earlier in his statement, Mr. Gordhan had talked of Mr. Moyane having laid charges against him, it would have been difficult to think that when Mr. Gordhan said he became the target of malicious and seemingly politically motivated criminal charges, he did not also intend to mean that the person who laid those charges against him also acted maliciously in laying them. Mr. Gordhan's reliance on the findings of Justice Nugent. Paragraph 8. Mr. Gordhan also highlights certain findings by Justice Nugent, which he says form, and I quote, double quotes, the basis for my belief that Mr. Moyane's actions as SARS Commissioner were part of the state capture project, close double quotes. Mr. Gordhan then deals with these findings in paragraphs 23 to 33 of his affidavit, whereafter comes the last paragraph of the affidavit. Paragraph 9. Mr. Gordhan refers to paragraphs 35 to 50 of Justice Nugent's interim report. He states that in those paragraphs, Justice Nugent set out, double quotes, the extraordinary turmoil at SARS and for its senior management in particular that followed Mr. Moyane's appointment, close double quotes. He then says in the following paragraph that, open double quotes, this included the filing of his criminal complaint against me in circumstances that Justice Nugent found, excuse me, open single quote, unclear and which were later withdrawn. This turmoil saw the removal of many senior SARS officials, creating the opportunity for Mr. Moyane to appoint senior management at SARS who failed to show the same integrity, skill, commitment to its critical functions, close quotes. 10. Mr. Gordhan goes on to state that in his statement to this commission dated 11 October 2018, specifically in paragraphs 104, 127, and 127.4, he, open double quotes, recorded numerous examples of the acrimonious nature of Mr. Moyane's rejection of my oversight while I was Minister of Finance, and his insulting attacks on me following my reappointment as Minister of Finance in December 2015, close quotes. Mr. Gordhan then says in the next paragraph, and I quote, double quotes, "This provides the context to and the basis for my belief that Mr. Moyane's laying off a complaint against me was something other than the actions of a reasonable commissioner of SARS," close double quotes. The reference to this, in quotes, at the beginning of this passage includes what Mr. Gordhan said in paragraph 26 of the clarificatory affidavit. 11. Mr. Gordhan then refers to a finding made by Justice Nugent and quoted the following passage from Justice Nugent's final report. Open double quotes. "The effective functioning of SARS calls for close collaboration between SARS and other institutions. It is to be expected that the Commissioner of SARS will liaise closely with the Minister of Finance, but while Mr. Gordhan held that position, there was active defiance. When Mr. Gordhan became concerned at the steps being taken to change the operating model, he asked for it to be suspended, but that was ignored. When he disapproved the extent of bonuses to be paid, Mr. Moyane again defied him, bringing him into conflict with the Auditor General. According to Treasury officials, the relationship between Treasury and Mr. Moyane has all been broken down, close double quotes. 12. Mr. Gordhan also states, open double quotes, considering my interactions with Mr. Moyane over this period and the subsequent findings of the Nugent inquiry, my personal belief remains that Mr. Moyane abused his position as the former SARS Commissioner to institute criminal proceedings against me and others under SAPS Brooklyn case number 427/05/15, since there was no reasonable basis for him to do so, close double quotes. 13. Mr. Gordhan goes on to state that he viewed Mr. Moyane's conduct, open double quotes, in filing the charges against me as yet another expression of the defiant attitude he exhibited towards me as found by Justice Nugent, close double quotes. I pause here to make the point that this allegedly defiant attitude by Mr. Moyane towards Mr. Gordhan, of which Mr. Gordhan says the laying of the criminal charge or complaint was another expression, is said by Mr. Gordhan elsewhere in his clarificatory affidavit to have been part of a campaign aimed at putting pressure on him to resign as Minister of Finance so as to capture National Treasury under a different minister. Mr. Gordhan added that Mr. Moyane's conduct in, open double quotes, filing the charges, close double quotes, open double quotes, against me, close double quotes, and open double quotes, also served the political purpose of attempting to pressure me and others to resign, thereby advancing state capture and the capture of National Treasury in particular, close double quotes. 14. The last paragraph in Mr. Gordhan's clarificatory affidavit is to the effect that Mr. Gordhan stands by his contention that his cross-examination by Mr. Moyane's legal representatives regarding Mr. Moyane's, in quotes, personal goals, personal motive for filing the complaint that led to criminal charges being brought against me, and my personal belief that those charges were part of the campaign to force my resignation from the position of Minister of Finance so as to facilitate the capture of National Treasury is unlikely to assist the important and urgent work of the Commission given its time and resource constraints, close double quotes. 15. Mr. Gordhan also states that his statement that Mr. Moyane abused legal processes when he laid a complaint against him is based on his experience of Mr. Moyane's, in brackets, defiant attitude and vilification of me following my reappointment as Minister of Finance, close double quotes. Mr. Gordhan then states that he believes that Mr. Moyane's, open double quotes, defiant attitude, close double quotes, and vilification, open double quotes, were aimed at forcing or pressuring me to resign from that position so that the capture of National Treasury could proceed under a different minister, close quotes. Mr. Moyane's response to the clarificatory affidavit. Paragraph 16, Mr. Moyane did not deliver an affidavit in response to Mr. Gordhan's clarificatory affidavit. He delivered written submissions. This was not inconsistent with the directions issued on 6 May 2019. In the written submissions, counsel for Mr. Moyane pointed out that the reason why Mr. Moyane did not deliver an affidavit was that, double quotes, Mr. Gordhan's affidavit actually confirms the allegations of malice on the part of Mr. Moyane, close quotes. In support of this, counsel for Mr. Moyane referred to, among others, Mr. Gordhan's statements quoted in 3B and Roman and I above. Mr. Moyane's counsel submitted that Mr. Moyane had already said that in laying the criminal complaint against Mr. Gordhan, he did not act maliciously, but acted in good faith and reasonably. The merits. 17. While Mr. Gordhan states he never alleged that Mr. Moyane acted malicious in laying the criminal complaint he laid against him, he states that as such commissioner, Mr. Moyane had adopted a defiant attitude towards him and had vilified him with the aim of forcing or pressuring him into resigning as Minister of Finance so that the capture of National Treasury could proceed under a different minister. Mr. Gordhan also states that Mr. Moyane, open double quotes, was motivated wholly or in part by or he sought to advance the objects of state capture. Thereafter, he states that he believes that while Mr. Moyane was SARS commissioner, his personal goals included the advancement of the state capture project. 18. There can be no doubt that if Mr. Moyane's defiant attitude towards and vilification of Mr. Gordhan were aimed at forcing or pressuring the latter into resigning as Minister of Finance so that the capture of the National Treasury could proceed under a different Minister of Finance, it would, generally speaking, be in the interest of the work of the Commission to grant Mr. Moyane leave to cross-examine Mr. Gordhan. Equally, there can be no doubt that if in laying the criminal complaint against Mr. Gordhan, Mr. Moyane was, and I open double quotes, motivated wholly or in part by or he sought to advance the objectives of state capture, it would, generally speaking, be in the interest of the work of this Commission that I grant Mr. Moyane leave to cross-examine Mr. Gordhan. 19. Mr. Gordhan did not in his statement of 11 October 2018 expressly say that he believed that in adopting the defiant attitude that he says Mr. Moyane adopted towards him after his reappointment as Minister of Finance, and in vilifying him, as he says Mr. Moyane did, Mr. Moyane sought to force him or to put pressure on him to resign from his position as Minister of Finance so that the capture of National Treasury could proceed under a different minister. Nor did Mr. Gordhan say in that statement that his position is that in laying the complaint against him, Mr. Moyane was motivated wholly or in part by or he sought to advance the objectives of state capture. 20. Mr. Gordhan also did not say in that statement that Mr. Moyane's personal goals while he was SARS Commissioner included the advancement of the state capture project. However, Mr. Gordhan seems to explain this when he says in his clarificatory affidavit that relevant findings made by Justice Nugent form the basis, or certain relevant findings made by Justice Nugent form the basis of his belief that Mr. Moyane's personal goals while he was SARS Commissioner included the advancement of the state capture project. It would seem that since those findings had not been made as yet when Mr. Gordhan made his statement in October 2018, Mr. Gordhan could not have formed that belief at the time, hence the absence of such allegations in that statement. Mr. Gordhan's belief seems to be a belief that he formed after Justice Nugent had made the findings to which Mr. Gordhan refers in his clarificatory affidavit. 21. In the directions I issued on 6 May 2019, it was stated that the directions were not intended to invite Mr. Gordhan or Mr. Moyane to furnish new facts which were not contained in their respective affidavits that had already been delivered to the Commission, but that only clarification was sought. Those directions were also to the effect that should Mr. Moyane wish to comment on Mr. Gordhan's clarificatory affidavit, he must deliver to the acting secretary of the Commission and serve on Mr. Gordhan a short affidavit on or before 21 May 2019, close quotes. As already indicated above, Mr. Moyane elected not to comment by way of an affidavit on Mr. Gordhan's clarificatory affidavit. The result is that Mr. Moyane has not responded by way of an affidavit or affirmed declaration to Mr. Gordhan's clarificatory affidavit to the effect that he does mean that Mr. Moyane was motivated in whole or in part by or he sought to advance the objective of state capture, or that Mr. Gordhan believes, in the light of certain findings made by Justice Nugent in his reports, that Mr. Moyane's personal goals while he was SARS Commissioner included the advancement of the state capture project. Indeed, he has not therefore given his version to this evidence. 23. Ordinarily, I would not grant an applicant leave to cross-examine a witness if he has not given his version to the allegations or evidence implicating him. Indeed, this is what happened when I considered Mr. Moyane's application for leave to cross-examine Mr. Gordhan in respect of other issues. However, this time Mr. Moyane previously did not consider it necessary to deliver an affidavit to deal with the allegations or evidence in Mr. Gordhan's clarificatory affidavit. The directions I had issued did not oblige him to do so. 24. The day before the hearing of argument on whether I should grant Mr. Moyane leave to cross-examine Mr. Gordhan on the outstanding issue, I caused a letter to be sent to Mrs. Gordhan's and Moyane's legal representatives, in which I indicated that my prima facie view was that I should grant Mr. Moyane leave to cross-examine Mr. Gordhan, but that should I grant such leave, it could be necessary that I direct Mr. Moyane to deliver an affidavit or affirmed declaration in which he would set out his version. In response to the letter, Mr. Moyane's legal representatives furnished the Commission with a letter which was to the effect that Mr. Moyane's primary contention was that I should grant him leave to cross-examine Mr. Gordhan without any precondition. The letter was also to the effect that the other options were for me to either grant Mr. Moyane leave to cross-examine Mr. Gordhan, but direct him to provide his version first as a precondition, or direct Mr. Moyane to first deliver his affidavit or affirmed declaration setting out his version, and only grant him leave to cross-examine Mr. Gordhan thereafter. Mr. Moyane's counsel confirmed this position during the hearing of argument. If I grant Mr. Moyane leave to cross-examine Mr. Gordhan, I will have to direct him to give his version. 25. On behalf of Mr. Moyane, it was submitted that the prima facie view I had expressed with regard to granting Mr. Moyane leave to cross-examine Mr. Gordhan was justified and correct, and that I should grant Mr. Moyane's application. On behalf of Mr. Gordhan, it was submitted that I should dismiss Mr. Moyane's application because Mr. Gordhan had never said that in laying the complaint that Mr. Moyane laid against Mr. Gordhan, he had acted maliciously. The difficulty that arises from this submission on behalf of Mr. Gordhan is that although Mr. Gordhan does not or does say that he never alleged that Mr. Moyane acted maliciously in laying the complaint he laid against him, he says elsewhere in his clarificatory affidavit that the laying of the complaint by Mr. Moyane had little or nothing to do with a legitimate complaint relating to an alleged crime. He also says that Mr. Moyane abused a legal process by laying the complaint that he laid against him. I also understand his evidence to be to the effect that in laying the criminal complaint that he laid against him, Mr. Moyane sought to advance the objects of state capture. 26. A question that may be asked is whether, by requiring Mr. Moyane to give his version to this commission on the issues raised in Mr. Gordhan's clarificatory affidavit, this commission is not repeating the work that has already been done by the SARS Commission. This commission does not wish to repeat the work of the SARS Commission. However, 2 or 3 observations need to be made in this regard. The first is that the terms of reference of the SARS Commission did not include an investigation into allegations of state capture. Secondly, this commission cannot make findings against Mr. Moyane or anyone for that matter. I'm going to repeat that. Secondly, this commission cannot make findings that Mr. Moyane or anyone for that matter performed their duties in order to advance the state capture project or the objectives of state capture without giving such a person the opportunity to be heard. It is necessary for this commission to hear Mr. Moyane's version or side of the story, and if it is in the interest of the work of this commission that he be granted leave to cross-examine Minister Gordhan, grant him such leave. An allegation that someone performed his or her duties in order to advance the state capture project is a serious allegation, and those facing such an allegation should be given an opportunity to defend themselves against it. 27, I consider that, subject to one condition, it is in the interest of the work of the Commission to grant Mr. Moyane leave to cross-examine Mr. Gordhan. Before this Commission, it must rank as the most serious allegation or statement for it to be said that you performed your official duties in order to advance the objectives of state capture. And speaking generally, such a person should be granted a leave to cross-examine if it is in the interest of the work of this commission to do so. The condition is that Mr. Moyane will have to deliver an affidavit or affirmed declaration in response to Mr. Gordhan's clarificatory affidavit so as to give this commission his version on issues raised in Mr. Gordhan's affidavit. I will therefore grant Mr. Moyane the required leave subject to that condition. In the result, my decision is the following. 1, subject to 2 below, Mr. Moyane is hereby granted leave to cross-examine Mr. Gordhan on A, whether in laying the criminal complaint or charges against Mr. Gordhan, Mr. Moyane acted maliciously. B, whether in laying the criminal complaint against Mr. Gordhan, Mr. Moyane was motivated wholly or in part by, or he sought to advance the objectives of state capture. C, whether in laying the criminal complaint against Mr. Gordhan, Mr. Moyane was abusing a legal process for his own personal goals that had nothing or little to do with a legitimate complaint relating to an alleged crime. D, whether as Commissioner of SARS, Mr. Moyane sought to advance the state capture project. E, whether Mr. Moyane's personal goals while he was SARS Commissioner included the advancement of the state capture project. 2, Mr. Moyane is directed to deliver to the acting secretary or secretary of the commission on or before 15 January 2020 an affidavit or affirmed declaration in which he responds to the clarificatory affidavit delivered by Mr. Gordhan. 3. Mr. Moyane's affidavit or affirmed declaration must make it clear which affirmance or allegations or statements in Mr. Gordhan's affidavit he admits or denies, what the basis are for denying or disputing those he denies or disputes, and give Mr. Moyane's full version in regard to the allegations or comments. 4. The amount of time that will be granted to Mr. Moyane to cross-examine to Mr. Moyane's counsel to cross-examine Mr. Gordhan will be determined at a later date. That is my decision.